I must say that I want to express my appreciation to my fellow task force members. They've worked very hard, and they've been very perceptive and insistent on getting answers that we needed. I'll mention that I want to thank the Crow people also, the folk who were doing the actual investigation, because they worked with us. Quite often we had questions about the facts, about policies and so on, and they always responded to us. And indeed, this morning I got a call from the chancellor who thanked the members for the work that we've done, and she says she's looking forward to working with the recommendations that we have included in our report. And I must say that we've been helped greatly by some staff members of the President's office in Oakland, folk from the General Counsel's office, and I want to particularly mention one gentleman, Kobe Crowder, who has worked with us from day one, in fact still working with us, because indeed, as I mentioned a minute ago, some of the work will just begin. I very much regret, and apparently you do too from the applause I heard, the delay in getting this report to you. I think that the best interest of the community would have been to have the report to you as quickly as possible. Some of the delays were caused by negotiation with the policemen's union to see whether or not the Croby investigators could meet with some of the police officers. That got resolved, but the greatest delay happened because of the lawsuit. Now, I don't particularly blame the lawyers who brought the lawsuit, or even the people who brought the lawsuit, because they brought it based on some legislation that has come from Sacramento. So my blame is on the legislators who have passed legislation that sometimes is referred to as the Policeman's Bill of Rights. But the reality is, as you can see in this case, that it does not permit the community to know exactly what happened, who's responsible for it, what can be done to correct it. And I think that that's a great disservice to the communities that deal with police officers, who after all are public servants. And I personally feel that it's a disservice to the police. The police can only do their job if they have the confidence of people who live in the community. If there isn't that confidence, because as some people have asked me, well, what are they trying to hide when they have filed a lawsuit saying that they don't want this type of report to get to the people most interested in it. Our report has had the task, therefore, of answering the questions. Incidentally, many of the folk who were involved in this situation, from the chancellor to others, I think proceeded in good faith, though they made, from our point of view, many serious mistakes, which we detail in our report. We had, as indicated, a quite diverse group of folk in our task force, and yet we reached a unanimous decision in terms of our recommendations and our report. So I think that's a good omen in terms of the strength of our report, both in terms of the facts that we give, who we say caused some of the problems, and what our solutions should be. Excuse me. Perhaps our whole report is capsulized by the first sentence in the report, when it says that the pepper spray could and should have been prevented, i.e., it should have happened. And yet the incident did happen. So our report, to a large extent, goes into examining why it did happen. And I'll just speak briefly to that. Since most of this time will be spent, I trust, with you folks asking questions, which is why the folk way in back were invited to come forward, because I think the mics are here closer. But let me give you a couple of examples. We begin by analyzing the role of the leadership team. That was the team, rather informal team, that got together with the chancellor to discuss any number of serious matters that come up in the university life. However, we found that informal leadership team approach did not work on this occasion. It turned out that, in fact, what decisions were made by leadership team was a matter of disagreement by some of the leadership members. Who made those decisions was not in agreement. And more importantly, even the basis for those decisions. Folks just ended up with many different understandings, and it's important, as the Crow report indicates and as our report indicates, that when a crisis like this comes up in a campus, it's very important to know who's in charge, who's responsible for what, and how it's going to be done. It's sad to say that rather informal consensus building process that was followed did not work on this occasion. The responsibility was not just the chancellor's. The responsibility, it seems to us, went to all of the members of that task force, because if they had qualms about something that should happen, they had a duty to bring it to the attention of the chancellor. We particularly focus on the decision to have the tents removed from the campus, and we had at least one of the members of the leadership team speak for many minutes about how, in her view, that step should not be taken when it was taken, but somehow she wasn't listened to sufficiently. And the task force had some bad information. One officer thought that during the Maverick Hall sit-in, practically all of the folk there were non-students, and in fact, that turned out to be not to be true. And I mention that because one of the concerns that the chancellor and the leadership team had was that there were too many, that there was a possibility that there were too many non-students in and around the tents, and that created perhaps some dangers to the students. And there was discussion about how could we explain to parents if something bad happened to their students. So there were serious concerns, and we acknowledged that, but we also faulted the leadership team for not looking at alternatives to going in at the time that they did, on the date that they did, to remove those tents. And we felt that the leadership team had a responsibility to, in fact, look at those possibilities. And then we looked at the practices of the campus police in terms of what their responsibility was, and looked at the responsibility of the police chief. If the plans as decided by the leadership team did make sense, it was her responsibility. It's a professional responsibility to bring that to the attention of the leadership team, and maybe they would have changed their mind if she had indeed brought that forth with the pressure that a police chief would have. And even after a decision was made, her own lieutenants and others within the police department said, we just can't do it the way we've been asked to do it. You can't go in not expecting some problems if you might end up having to arrest people and so on. And yet those concerns again were not brought up were not brought before the leadership team. So as I've mentioned to more than one person, we aren't making anybody happy with our report, because we find that there's a lot that should have happened that didn't happen. With respect to the actual conduct of the police, there were just serious faults, if you will. The practice is to have a plan, which makes a lot of sense, and in fact they did have a plan. Unfortunately, the plan was inadequate, but even that inadequate plan was not followed by the campus police when they went into the area where the tents were. For example, the plan did not have in it the very important matter of what they were going to do with anybody who was arrested, and that turned out to be rather crucial in this case, because the reason that people formed around the arrestees was that they had no place to send the arrestees, so they just held them there, and students, many of them probably not even involved with the protest, and sort of went over to see what was going on. But with respect to the pepper spray itself, objectively, there was really no reason, we conclude, to have used the pepper spray. We assumed, because some of the officers said, well, they were a little bit scared because they were surrounded. But in fact, when we looked at the tapes, when the Crow people looked at the tapes, we found out that that they were not completely surrounded, that there was one officer who, in fact, took two arrestees through the students that were around. That is, objectively speaking, there was no basis for them to indeed have any fear or to have done what they did. And one of the reasons they did do what they did, particularly the spray, was to make a way to take the arrestees to where the cars were waiting for them to then take them, they had hoped, to a bus. Whether or not a bus was even I forget the bus actually existing at the police station. I forget, there was something said about that. I think it didn't even exist. That is, they had hoped to have a bus, but it wasn't even in existence. So the spraying took place so the police could go through to take the folk they had arrested to cars that were waiting. In fact, again, it was shown that there was no danger when the city police arrived. The campus police were able to take them through the crowd. The police officers, as I mentioned, took a couple of arrestees through the crowd. The crowd was not that thick, nor that challenging. So objectively speaking, that was our conclusion. And as to the facts. And then, of course, our report goes into the matter of individual responsibilities in light of the facts that we looked at. And finally, of course, we come to the recommendations, which perhaps is the most important part. We note that our hope is that, in fact, we will be able to make even more firm the notion of the principles of community that UC Davis has, in fact, had for a while, and that folk who are at odds now will, in fact, be able to get together. So we recommend to the administration, that is the leadership team and the chancellor, that they develop rules ahead of time to how they will act when there's civil disobedience. And those rules have to be cognizant of any possible changes, and importantly, they have to take into account the right of students to free speech. They have to define what is considered violence, what is not. They have to define what the consequences will be of violating those rules. That is, a lot of thinking has to be done ahead of time. The leadership team has to have its own structure about how it proceeds. Who the members are. Minutes have to be taken. It has to be very clear who's made what decision and what the action is going to be. And the structure, sad to say, of that informal approach simply did not meet the requirements of a crisis like the crisis we saw. And then, excuse me, we suggest that they have clear procedures about what to do if, in fact, there's a large demonstration. We do note that the development of large folk getting together to complain, as has been true in many cities recently, is somewhat of a new phenomenon. Sometimes the groups sort of pride themselves on not having a spokesperson. In times past, there was always an identified spokesperson or persons that those against whom the protest was aimed at would then be able to talk to those folks. So I think that the university has to recognize those new developments and figure out exactly how to respond in such a way that it protects the rights of all concerned. And then with respect to the police, sworn officers have a special responsibility. They can't just go out and arrest anybody. They have to have a good basis for it. And sad to say, there was confusion in terms of even the basis for any possible arrests. For example, there was a rule, a university rule, that folk couldn't camp at night. But here folk were camping during the day. Well, was that sufficient enough basis for the police to make an arrest? Obviously, the regulations could be enforced by somebody, but could they be enforced by sworn police officers? So we recommend that there be structures to that, that there even be a review of how many sworn officers we need on a campus. The role of the police officers on a campus is very different than that of a city or a county, and it may be that the campus would do better just having a few sworn police officers and other officers who are trained but are not sworn police officers. And we recommend training, better training for officers when they're working on a campus, because, as I say, the role of a police officer on a campus is really quite different than in other locales. Indeed, this campus already had a group called Aggie Hosts. These are students who work with the police officers, and we're suggesting that there be thought about maybe expanding that, because the students presumably understand how other students react, and they could be of help in that regard. And then we have a few recommendations, even though there's another committee that's actually making recommendations on statewide matters. We were asked to take a look at that, and we recommend again that there be special training, maybe even setting up an academy for the officers that work in campuses, because in our judgment their role is so different. And if an academy is set up, maybe it could even include officers who work for the state system, maybe the community college system. So the whole relationship of sworn police officers to the campus, I think, needs to be taken a look at. And very clear rules need to be made about interagency policies. That is, what happened here was that the campus had asked other campuses to send their police. Then the police chief here had asked her officers not to get in full gear. Then the officer said, wait, we can't go into a dangerous situation like this without full gear, and then she sort of gave in to them. In some ways, I've been thinking about this. I can understand that they had that concern, because officers coming from other campuses would indeed come with full gear, and yet when folk appear in full gear, there's a quick negative reaction by folk that see them coming. So we think that needs to be done. And finally, we have a formal recommendation that the President and the regions look at the issue of the Policeman's Bill of Rights, because it has ill-served this community, and I have personally seen other situations where it has ill-served those communities, when folk can't find out without bringing a lawsuit and having subpoena power whether the officer did the right thing or the wrong thing, or whether things can be changed to make it better. So that's a quick summary, as you can tell, of a rather lengthy report on our part, and a lengthier report on the part of the Crow people. And I just want to mention one other thing to you. It's just of interest to me, and maybe to you too. The judge had said one time, well, you can make public certain parts of the report. And we got a lot of phone calls from the press, and we said, we don't think we ought to make it public at that point, because so much had been redacted at that time that we didn't think it would serve the purpose, though we could have made something public. I just want to mention, to show you here, 2 pages of our original report, every single word redacted. So we thought that it would be a faulty step on our part to give you that report, and you wouldn't even understand the basis for our recommendations. But again, this just indicates to you the power that folk have to go in and get a temporary restraining order because of the legislation passed by people called legislators in Sacramento, and then giving lawyers really the legal right to go in and get a temporary restraining order. End of my sermonette.